Let's get started. Story number 1.
I had never been one to believe in ghosts. Sure, I'd heard the stories, the ones about haunted houses, restless spirits, and eerie happenings, but I always chalked it up to overactive imaginations, or people simply being too quick to jump to conclusions. My skepticism had served me well for years, helping me keep a level head, even in the most unsettling situations. But all of that changed one winter night when I found myself staying at an old inn on the outskirts of a small town in Maine. I had been traveling for work, visiting various remote towns to write a series of articles about regional history. One town in particular had piqued my interest, Valley Ridge. Its location at the edge of the forest, paired with its fascinating history of seafaring families and ghostly legends, made it an intriguing destination. The town was quiet, almost eerily so, and my research led me to a particular place to stay, a centuries-old inn that had once been a bustling tavern for merchants and travelers. The Valley Ridge Inn was as charming as it was imposing, sitting atop a hill with a perfect view of the village below. From the outside, it looked like something out of an old Victorian novel, a 3-story building with dark wood paneling, ivy creeping up the sides, and a covered porch that wrapped around the front. The windows, large and numerous, gleamed in the twilight, and the entire building seemed to have a certain weight about it. It was the type of place that felt timeless, as if it had seen more years than it cared to count. When I arrived, the innkeeper, a thin man with an air of quiet dignity named Mr. Wells, greeted me warmly. He was polite, but distant, his movements deliberate, as though every action was carefully measured. He offered me a room on the second floor, an old, modest space with a large, canopied bed and dark wooden furniture. A fireplace sat in the corner, and the smell of burning wood filled the air. The room felt cozy, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was just the strange, quiet aura of the entire inn. That night, after a long day of traveling, I retired to my room early, eager for a good night's sleep. The wind howled outside, causing the branches of the trees to scrape against the window. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Despite the warmth and comfort, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, like I wasn't entirely alone. I dismissed it, chalking it up to exhaustion from my journey. As I lay in bed, I closed my eyes and drifted off to sleep. It was sometime in the middle of the night that I was awakened by a faint noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe the house settling, but the noise persisted, growing louder, and I realized it was coming from the hallway outside my door. It was a soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps, but slow and deliberate. Someone was walking up and down the hallway. I lay still in bed, straining my ears to listen. The footsteps continued, but they didn't sound like the hurried steps of someone in a rush. They were slow, dragging, almost as if the person was walking with a limp or dragging something heavy behind them. The sound grew louder, then quieter, as though the person was moving closer to my room, then farther away again. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped altogether. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The silence that followed felt suffocating, as though the entire house had held its breath. I glanced at the door, half expecting it to swing open, but nothing happened. The air in the room felt heavy now, almost thick, like it was pressing against me. I stood up and walked to the door, my bare feet quiet on the wooden floor. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what I would find if I opened it. The hallway outside was dark, but I could make out the faint outline of a shadow against the light coming from the staircase at the far end. The house was still. Too still. After a long pause, I twisted the doorknob and slowly pushed the door open. The hallway was empty. The shadow had disappeared, and the only sound was the faint whisper of the wind outside. I stepped into the hallway, my pulse quickening, and made my way down to the staircase. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I felt a sudden chill crawl up my spine. There was nothing unusual in the hallway. No sign of anyone, no footprints in the dust. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the flickering light from the staircase cast odd shapes across the walls. I was starting to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing when I heard it again. The soft shuffling, only this time it was much closer, almost as if it were coming from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The air was still, and the footsteps had stopped once again. My heart was pounding in my chest now, and I was beginning to feel a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. My mind raced through every logical explanation I could think of, but none of them made sense. No one else was supposed to be in the inn. Mr. Wells had told me there were no other guests, and yet I wasn't alone. I slowly made my way back to my room, closing the door behind me with a soft click. The sound of the footsteps still echoed in my mind, and as I lay back down, I felt a cold draft sweep through the room. It was almost as if someone had opened the window, but when I glanced over, it was still closed. I pulled the covers tighter around me, trying to block out the unease that had settled into my bones. But sleep wouldn't come. My eyes darted around the room, searching the shadows, waiting for something, anything, to happen. I don't know how long I lay there, tense and restless, but at some point, exhaustion took over, and I finally drifted off again. The next morning, I woke to the soft light of dawn spilling through the curtains. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if it had been holding its breath all night. I got up quickly, eager to put the previous night's strange events behind me. I dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Mr. Wells preparing breakfast in the dining room. "Sleep well?" he asked, his voice polite, but with an odd note of caution. I hesitated. I heard something last night. Footsteps, shuffling. It sounded like someone was walking outside my room. Mr. Wells didn't look up from the stove as he scrambled eggs in the pan. "Ah, you heard it too," he murmured. "Excuse me?" I asked, taken aback. He finally turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "You're not the first person to hear the footsteps. This house, it has a history. Some things can't be explained. We've had other guests, people who swear they heard the same thing. There's nothing I can do to stop it, I'm afraid." His words hung in the air, heavy with something unspoken. He seemed to regret saying them, but there was no mistaking the truth in his voice. This wasn't the first time someone had encountered something strange in this inn. "Have you ever seen anything?" I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. He paused, then shook his head. "No. But the stories? They say a man died here long ago. He was the previous owner back in the 1800s. He was said to have died in his sleep, but some believe that's not how it happened. Some say he still walks the halls." I swallowed hard. "A ghost?" Mr. Wells didn't answer right away. Instead, he focused on the eggs again, his movements deliberate. Finally, he said, "I wouldn't call it a ghost. It's more like a presence, something left behind." I didn't know what to say to that. The idea of an invisible presence, something that lingered but never showed itself, was somehow more unsettling than the thought of an actual apparition. It was as though the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. That day, I packed up and left Valley Ridge as soon as I could. I didn't want to stay another night in that inn. I still don't know what I heard that night or what Mr. Wells meant by a presence. But I do know that I'll never forget the cold, the footsteps, and the feeling that I was never truly alone in that old inn. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I had always been a skeptic. Ever since I was young, I was taught to rely on reason and logic, and I carried those principles into my adult life. Ghosts, spirits, hauntings, all of it seemed like superstitions, things that only the fearful or uneducated believed in. I dismissed the stories of strange occurrences, dismissing them as coincidence or the result of overactive imaginations. I lived a peaceful, uneventful life in the city, far away from the small towns that seemed to be steeped in these ghostly legends. But then something happened that changed everything. It all started when I inherited an old family estate from an aunt I had never met. My aunt, Margaret, had lived in a secluded house on the edge of town. From what I gathered, she had been quite the eccentric, living alone for most of her adult life and avoiding contact with most of the family. When I received the call informing me of her passing, I felt little more than a distant curiosity. I didn't know her well, and I certainly didn't expect much from her estate. But it was mine now, and I decided to take a weekend trip out to the house, if only to see what was left behind. The house was located at the edge of a small town in the northeastern United States, a region known for its dense forests and old colonial-style homes. As I drove through the winding roads leading up to it, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The trees lined the road like sentinels, casting long shadows over the path. The house itself was a large two-story building with faded red brick and an overgrown garden that had once been carefully tended but was now choked with weeds and ivy. Its windows were dark and vacant, giving the house an abandoned, forlorn look. I parked in front of the large wooden door and hesitated. The air around the house felt thick, almost oppressive. It wasn't the kind of place you would choose to visit on a bright, sunny day, let alone in the dead of winter when the air was cold and still. I gathered my courage and walked up the creaking front steps, noticing that the door wasn't locked. I stepped inside, the door groaning on its hinges, and immediately felt a rush of cold air that seemed to seep into my bones. The interior of the house was dimly lit by the fading light of the winter afternoon, and the musty smell of old wood and dust filled my nose. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I walked down the narrow hallway. I passed a few rooms, their doors ajar, and saw old furniture covered in sheets, abandoned as if the house had been frozen in time. The house seemed empty, but not in the way you might expect. There was a certain presence in the air, a quiet heaviness, like something was watching me. I shook off the discomfort and began to explore more, opening doors to see what remained. The upstairs rooms were much the same. Dust-covered furniture, stacks of old books, and shelves filled with knickknacks and trinkets that hadn't been touched in years. As I walked down the long hallway, one door caught my eye. It was at the very end, a smaller room that I had somehow missed earlier. It was an odd room, tucked away in a corner, almost like an afterthought. I opened the door, and the air inside felt even colder than the rest of the house. The room was small, with a single window covered by heavy curtains. The furniture was sparse, just a small bed, an old wooden chair, and a desk cluttered with papers. But what struck me most was the portrait on the wall. It was a painting of a woman, dressed in a dark Victorian gown, her face pale and expressionless. Her eyes seemed to follow me as I stepped inside, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with it, something unsettling about her gaze. I studied the painting for a moment before turning away, not wanting to linger too long. But as I moved toward the door to leave, I noticed something strange, a faint sound coming from the far side of the room. It was a soft rustling, like paper being moved by the wind. I turned back, thinking it might be the curtains shifting, but they were still. The sound continued, though, coming from behind the desk. I hesitated, then moved toward the desk, the floor creaking under my feet. When I reached it, I looked around the clutter and saw that a piece of paper was fluttering slightly. There was no draft in the room, no open window, nothing to explain the movement. I picked it up, and as I read it, I felt a chill run down my spine. The paper was a letter dated over 30 years ago, written in elegant handwriting that I didn't recognize. The letter was addressed to Margaret, my aunt. As I read through it, I began to piece together a strange and unsettling story. The letter described a series of mysterious events that had taken place in the house. It spoke of strange noises, whispers in the dark, and an ever-present feeling of being watched. The writer mentioned seeing a figure standing in the doorway at night and hearing footsteps when no one was there. The final lines of the letter made my heart race. There is something in this house, something that I cannot explain. It is not just the wind, Margaret. It is something far worse. I believe it has followed me here. I felt a sharp sense of unease settle over me. I didn't want to believe what I was reading, but the letter felt too real to dismiss. I quickly folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket, making a mental note to ask the locals about it later. As I turned to leave the room, I heard something, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. It was a whisper, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere deep in the house. My heart stopped, and I stood frozen for a moment, listening intently. The whisper was followed by a soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps moving across the floor. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Perhaps it was just the old house settling, or the wind playing tricks. But as the footsteps grew louder, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread creeping over me. I was alone in the house. There was no one else here. I moved cautiously down the hallway, the sound of the footsteps seeming to follow me. The air was thick with tension, and my breath came in short, shallow gasps. I turned a corner, and as I did, I caught sight of something at the far end of the hallway, a shadow, dark and indistinct, moving slowly toward me. My heart raced as I stood paralyzed, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. It was only for a moment, but in that brief instant, I saw it clearly. A woman in a long, flowing dress, her face hidden in shadow. She was walking toward me, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she had all the time in the world. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The shadow stopped in the middle of the hallway, its presence suffocating. I took a hesitant step back, and the shadow seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving nothing but the cold, empty hallway in its wake. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to comprehend what I had just witnessed. I wasn't sure what I had seen, whether it was a figment of my imagination or something far more sinister. But in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. I was not alone in that house. I left the room, bolting out of the house and into the freezing night air. The whispers and footsteps seemed to follow me, echoing in my mind long after I had driven away. I never returned to that house again. To this day, I don't know what I experienced that night, but I can't shake the feeling that something in that house was trying to communicate with me. And as much as I wish I could say it was all just a dream, a trick of the mind, I know deep down that it wasn't. Some things, no matter how hard we try to explain them, remain a mystery, and some houses are meant to be left alone. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I was never one to believe in ghosts. Growing up, I had always chalked up the creepy stories I heard to superstition, or maybe the overactive imaginations of those around me. I had heard plenty of tales over the years from friends, family, and even strangers, but I never thought anything of it. That is, until the night I stayed in the old farmhouse at the edge of town. The house had been in my family for generations. It was an old, rambling structure that had been passed down from relative to relative. My great-grandfather had built it during the early 1900s, and over the years, the house had seen various renovations and updates, but it had always retained that certain rustic charm. It was located just outside of a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and it was considered to be a bit of a landmark, though not necessarily in the best way. People whispered about it behind closed doors, and there were rumors that the house was haunted. But I had never paid much attention to the gossip. Last year, my aunt passed away, and as the eldest child, I became the owner of the farmhouse. It was a bit of a responsibility, but I figured I could sell it or maybe restore it and turn it into something useful. But when I finally visited the house for the first time in years, there was something about it that made me hesitate. The air in the house felt heavy, like it was holding on to something. As soon as I stepped through the front door, a chill ran down my spine, and I felt something shift in the pit of my stomach, though I couldn't quite place why. It was the middle of winter, and the snow had already begun to fall heavily, coating the ground with a thick layer of white. I didn't plan on staying overnight, but as the evening wore on, the snowstorm outside intensified. The wind howled against the windows, and I realized I wasn't going to be able to make the drive back home in such conditions. So I reluctantly decided to stay the night in the farmhouse. The house was silent, except for the occasional creaks of the old structure settling. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I made my way through the dimly lit hallway, the faint glow of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I had spent some time in the house when I was younger, so I knew my way around, but it felt different now, darker somehow. There were rooms I didn't remember, and some of the old furniture seemed to have shifted positions, though I was certain I hadn't moved anything. I made my way up to the bedroom where my aunt had passed away. It was at the end of the hall, and I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The room was exactly as I remembered it, dimly lit by the moonlight streaming in through the curtains. A 4-poster bed stood against the far wall, its heavy, dark wood giving the room an almost oppressive feel. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of dust and something faintly metallic, like old iron. I felt my throat tighten as I stepped further into the room, but I tried to shake it off. After closing the door behind me, I unpacked my things and settled into the bed, pulling the thick blankets up to my chin. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, but the house was otherwise quiet. I tried to distract myself by checking my phone, scrolling through social media, and texting a few friends, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over me. Something wasn't right. I finally put my phone down and turned off the light. The darkness was absolute, and for a moment I just lay there, listening to the sounds of the wind and the creaking house. But as I lay there in the silence, I heard something. It was faint at first, like a whisper, almost imperceptible. I strained my ears, thinking it was the wind, but it didn't quite sound like that. It was too deliberate, too human. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to place the sound. It wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from within the house. The sound, now clearer, seemed to be footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking through the hallway outside the door. My blood ran cold. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I listened, and the footsteps continued, echoing through the hallway, closer and closer. I reached for my flashlight, heart pounding in my chest, but before I could even turn it on, the sound stopped. Dead silence. Not even the wind outside could be heard. The sudden quiet was worse than the footsteps. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to call out, to scream, but my voice caught in my chest. Then I heard it again, a soft knock at the door. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. My aunt had passed away here, and she was the only one who had ever lived in this house alone, aside from the occasional visit from family members. The idea that I might not be alone in the house made my skin crawl. The knock came again, followed by the sound of slow, methodical footsteps retreating down the hallway. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to get out, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, unable to tear myself away from the door. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that maybe I was just tired, or maybe the house was settling again. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably. I could see my breath in the air. Slowly, I got out of bed and made my way to the door. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, but I forced myself to turn it, slowly cracking the door open just a sliver. The hallway was empty. No one was there. I exhaled a shaky breath, telling myself it had to be some kind of trick of the mind. Maybe it had just been the house creaking or some animal outside. But the chill in the air was impossible to ignore, and the silence was so thick I could feel it pressing against me. I stepped back into the room, locking the door behind me, but the unease didn't go away. I lay in bed for what felt like hours, staring into the dark. I tried to convince myself to fall asleep, to forget about the footsteps, but something kept me awake. The air felt too heavy. I kept hearing noises from the hallway. Soft whispers, muffled footsteps, even the faint sound of something scraping against the floor. It was as though someone or something was moving just beyond my reach, watching me, waiting. At some point, exhaustion finally overtook me, and I drifted off to sleep. But I was restless. I dreamt of the house, of dark, empty hallways and rooms that stretched on forever. I dreamt of a woman, her face pale and her eyes hollow, standing at the end of the hall, just out of reach. She reached out for me, but when I tried to scream, no sound came. I awoke with a start, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was still dark, but the air felt wrong, oppressive. I looked around, feeling like I was being watched. The wind outside had stopped, leaving the house unnaturally still. My gaze landed on the corner of the room, where a shadow stood, tall and indistinct, its outline shifting slightly as if it were made of smoke. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The shadow didn't move either, just stood there watching me. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, it was gone. I didn't stay another minute. I grabbed my things and rushed out of the room, out of the house, and didn't stop running until I reached my car. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me, something that had followed me out of that house. I never went back. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I had always considered myself a logical person. I believed in what I could see, touch, and experience. Ghost stories were always something I dismissed, chalking up strange occurrences to coincidence, overactive imaginations, or the natural settling sounds of an old house. But that changed when I moved into an old, 2-story Victorian house in a small town I had recently relocated to for work. The house, though somewhat weathered, had a charm about it. It was a spacious, 3-bedroom house with a large garden and a wraparound porch. The landlord, a kindly elderly man named Mr. Brown, had warned me that the house was old and would need some care, but he assured me there was nothing to be concerned about. He'd even lived there himself for a few years before moving to a smaller place. He smiled as he handed me the keys, telling me, "You'll love it here, dear. It's peaceful." The first few days were peaceful, just as he had promised. I settled in quickly, unpacking my boxes and enjoying the solitude. I found the quiet of the town comforting, and I spent my evenings sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the distant hills. The house creaked with age, the floorboards groaning underfoot, but I didn't mind. It added to the character of the place. But as the days went on, strange things began to happen. At first, they were small things, little oddities that I brushed off as quirks of an old house. I'd hear the faint sound of footsteps late at night, as if someone was walking upstairs when I knew I was alone. The lights would flicker occasionally, and once I could have sworn I saw a shadow move in the corner of my eye when I was in the kitchen. But every time I tried to make sense of it, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had just moved into a new environment, and the house was bound to make noises. One night, I was sitting in the living room reading a book when the feeling of being watched washed over me. It wasn't just a fleeting sensation. It was intense, as if something was there, just behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing. No one. Still, the feeling didn't fade. It lingered, like a cold presence hanging in the air. I brushed it off as anxiety from the stress of settling into a new place, but the discomfort stayed with me. That night, as I tried to fall asleep, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps from upstairs. Slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking from one room to another. I sat up in bed, listening intently. My heart began to race. I knew I was alone, but the footsteps were getting closer, moving down the hall toward the stairs. It was so vivid, so real, that I could almost hear the floorboards creak underfoot. But when I got out of bed and went to investigate, the house was silent. There was nothing. I convinced myself that it was the house settling again, or perhaps the wind making the floorboards creak. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to ignore it, but the next few nights were even worse. The footsteps continued, always at the same time, always coming from upstairs, and always just as I was about to fall asleep. After a week of restless nights, I decided to take a walk around the house, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. I wandered around the back past the garden when I noticed something strange. Near the corner of the garden, there was a small, overgrown pathway leading into the woods. I hadn't seen it before, but it looked like it might have been an old path, possibly leading to another part of the property. I was curious, so I decided to follow it. The path twisted through the trees, and the further I went, the more I felt the weight of silence pressing in around me. The air grew cooler, the leaves crunching underfoot. After a few minutes of walking, I found myself standing in front of an old, crumbling stone wall. It was covered in ivy, but I could make out the faint outline of a small gate. I pushed through the overgrown vines and found that the gate was slightly ajar. I hesitated, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped through. On the other side of the gate was a small clearing, and in the center there was an old stone bench. It looked like it had been there for years, weathered and worn by time. I couldn't explain it, but something about that bench gave me a strange feeling. It was as though it was waiting for me, or that it had been part of a memory long forgotten. As I stood there, I heard a rustling sound behind me, followed by a faint whisper. I spun around, but there was no one there. The whisper was so faint that I thought I might have imagined it, but the feeling of unease lingered. I didn't want to stay any longer, so I turned to leave. But as I stepped away, I noticed something strange on the ground. A small, weathered photograph was lying in the dirt, half buried under fallen leaves. I knelt down to pick it up, and as I dusted it off, I saw a picture of a woman. Her face was pale, her expression solemn. There was something about her eyes that unnerved me, as though she was staring directly at me. I flipped the photo over, hoping to find something that might explain its presence, but there was only a name written on the back in faded ink: Margaret Hawthorne. I didn't know who Margaret Hawthorne was, but something about the photo sent a chill down my spine. I decided to take it back with me to the house, hoping it might give me some clue about the strange events I had been experiencing. That night, after dinner, I sat down in the living room with the photo in hand. I tried to do some research online, searching for any information about a woman named Margaret Hawthorne, but I found nothing. I even asked Mr. Brown about it the next time I saw him, but he didn't seem to know anything about her. He said he had never heard of anyone by that name living in the house. I placed the photo on the mantel above the fireplace, telling myself it was just an old relic of the past. But every time I looked at it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to the strange occurrences in the house. I tried to move on, convincing myself that I was just imagining things. But things only grew worse. The footsteps continued, growing louder and more distinct each night. And then one evening, as I was sitting in the kitchen, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room. It was coming from the hallway where I had hung the photo of Margaret Hawthorne. The lights flickered and the temperature dropped suddenly, as though the house had become a different place. I got up, feeling the familiar sensation of being watched, and walked toward the hallway. The air was thick with an oppressive silence. I stood in front of the photo, and for the first time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The photo had moved. It was no longer facing forward. Instead, it was tilted at an odd angle, as though someone had picked it up and turned it. My heart raced. I reached out to adjust it, but as my fingers brushed against the frame, I heard the faint whisper again. This time it was clearer. Leave. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, cold and harsh. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, reverberating through the house. I pulled my hand away, my skin prickling with fear. The house felt alive, as though it was watching me, waiting for me to leave. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in the house any longer, but I also couldn't bring myself to leave everything behind. I spent the next few days trying to figure out my options, but the footsteps, the whispers, and the overwhelming sense of unease never stopped. Every time I thought I might be imagining things, something new would happen, something undeniable. It wasn't until I came across an old newspaper article in a small local library that I learned the truth. Margaret Hawthorne was the wife of the original owner of the house, a man named Thomas Hawthorne. According to the article, Thomas had died under mysterious circumstances, and shortly after his death, Margaret had disappeared without a trace. The house had been abandoned for years after that, and no one knew what had happened to her. The article mentioned that some people believed Margaret's spirit still lingered in the house, restless and angry. They said that she was searching for something, maybe her husband or maybe closure, and that she would never leave until she found it. I didn't know if it was true, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't stay in the house anymore. I packed my things and left that very night, leaving the photo behind and never looking back. I've never forgotten the house or the strange occurrences that led to my decision to leave. Every now and then I wonder if someone else has moved in, and if they too have felt the presence of Margaret Hawthorne.
Story number 5.
It was a late autumn evening when I moved into the old house at the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a small, weathered cottage tucked between trees, hidden away from the main road. The house had been abandoned for years, its previous owners having left without a word. I'd been searching for a quiet, peaceful place to settle in, away from the noise and bustle of city life, and when I stumbled upon this house, I thought it was exactly what I was looking for. The house had a certain charm, a kind of old-fashioned character that I couldn't resist. The wooden beams creaked in the wind, the floors groaned with age, but there was something comforting about it. The smell of old wood and the quiet hum of nature outside made it feel almost timeless. I wasn't someone who believed in ghosts or spirits, so the rumors of strange happenings in the area didn't bother me much. I chalked them up to local superstitions, things that always seem to accompany old houses. The first few days were spent cleaning, unpacking, and settling in. The house wasn't in terrible condition, but it had certainly been neglected for some time. The kitchen was small but functional, the living room cozy with a large stone fireplace that I imagined would be perfect for the colder nights ahead. There was also an attic, which I only ventured into once. It was filled with old furniture, dust-covered boxes, and forgotten relics, but nothing unusual stood out to me. It seemed like an old storage space, untouched for years. By the end of the week, I was already getting used to the quiet. The only sounds that filled the house were the rustling of the trees outside and the occasional chirp of crickets. I would spend my evenings reading or working on small repairs around the house. One of the things I had come to appreciate most about the place was how peaceful it was. It was exactly the kind of environment I needed to clear my mind. But then things started to change. Small noises that I couldn't quite place. A creak of the floorboards when I was alone, the faint sound of something scraping against the walls in the middle of the night. At first, I tried to ignore it, blaming it on the old house settling or the wind. But as the days passed, the noises became harder to dismiss. One night, I was lying in bed when I heard it clearly, a soft, dragging sound like something was being pulled across the floor upstairs. My heart raced. I lay still, straining to hear, but the sound stopped almost as quickly as it had started. I told myself it was nothing more than the house settling again. But that night, I didn't sleep well. The following night, I woke up to the same sound, this time much louder. It sounded like something was moving across the floor directly above my bedroom. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. I waited for the noise to stop, but it continued, dragging, scraping, dragging. Closer now. I didn't know what to do. I sat frozen in bed, unable to move, my eyes glued to the ceiling as if expecting something to come crashing down. But nothing did. The noise stopped after what felt like an eternity. The next day, I decided to investigate. I went upstairs to the bedroom above mine, but when I opened the door, everything seemed perfectly normal. The floor was covered in dust and the furniture was untouched. There was nothing unusual. I checked the attic, but it was just as I remembered. Dark, cluttered, and full of old things. There was no sign of anything that could have caused the sound, but the feeling of unease had already settled in my stomach. That night, the sound came again, louder than before. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way upstairs, my heart pounding with every step. I reached the door to the bedroom above mine and hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me on the other side. I opened it slowly, shining the flashlight into the room. At first, there was nothing. The room was empty, just as it had been before. But then, I saw something in the corner, just a glimpse of movement. It was fleeting, like a shadow flickering in the corner of my eye. My breath caught in my throat, and I stepped closer, shining the flashlight in the direction of the movement, but the room was still empty. I turned to leave, my heart racing, but then I heard it again, the soft, dragging sound. It was coming from the far corner of the room, where I had seen the shadow. I rushed over, shining the flashlight wildly around, but there was nothing there. The room was still, and the sound had stopped. But I knew something was wrong. I spent the next few days trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was living alone in an old house in the middle of nowhere. It was easy to let my mind wander and start to hear things. Maybe the house was just settling, or maybe the wind was playing tricks on me. I tried to ignore it, but every night the noise returned. The dragging sound, the creaks, the whispers. Each time I grew more and more uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Then, one evening, I decided to confront it. I had read a little about the history of the house before I moved in, just to get a sense of its past, but I hadn't found anything out of the ordinary. It had been built in the early 1900s by a man named Charles Caldwell, who had lived there with his wife and 2 children. According to the records, the family had moved away shortly after Charles died, and the house had been vacant ever since. There were no reports of anything strange happening, no deaths or accidents that might explain the odd noises. But as I sat in the living room that evening, the air grew colder. The fire in the hearth flickered and died, leaving the room in near darkness. I felt a cold gust of wind sweep through the room, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. The sound came again, a faint scraping, like nails against wood. This time, it was coming from directly below me, from the living room floor. I froze. I couldn't explain it. The floor was solid, unyielding. The scraping grew louder, as if something was moving beneath the floorboards. Panic gripped me, and I jumped to my feet, backing away from the source of the noise. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was closing in around me. I couldn't breathe. Then, the floorboards creaked, and the sound stopped. I turned toward the front door, intending to leave, but I heard something else, something even more unsettling. A low whisper coming from somewhere deep within the house. It was faint, but unmistakable. It was a voice, soft but clear, and it was saying my name. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran out of the house, out into the night, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I reached the neighbor's house, a small farmhouse a mile or so down the road. I told them what had happened, but they only looked at me with pity, as if they'd heard the story 1,000 times before. They didn't say anything about the house itself, but they did mention something odd. "You're not the first one to move into that place," the neighbor said. "Over the years, people have come and gone. Some of them last longer than others, but they all end up leaving. There's something about that house, something people don't talk about." I didn't sleep that night, but I didn't return to the house either. The next morning, I went back to gather my things. The house was quiet again, almost too quiet. The air felt stale, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting for me to come back. But I couldn't stay there anymore. I couldn't ignore what had happened, what I had felt. There was something in that house, something that didn't want me there. I packed my things, left the house behind, and never returned. I still don't know what it was, whether it was a spirit, a presence, or something else entirely. But I learned that some places are better left alone, their stories better left untold. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The rain had been falling for hours, drumming against the roof and windows in a steady rhythm, filling the air with a damp chill. The roads outside were slick and empty, reflecting the dim glow of streetlights that flickered like dying embers. Daniel had been driving for hours, trying to make his way home after a long business trip. The GPS had led him through endless stretches of rural backroads, winding through thick, silent woods. He hadn't passed another car in nearly an hour, and a growing unease crept over him. His gas tank was nearly empty, and the next town wasn't for miles. Cursing under his breath, he kept an eye out for a gas station, but all he saw was darkness, punctuated by the occasional broken-down barn or abandoned house. Then just ahead, something caught his eye. A wooden sign, weathered and leaning to one side, barely legible in the rain. Willow House. 2 miles relief washed over him. An inn, a place to rest, gas for the car. He turned down the small road, following the path deeper into the woods. After a few minutes, a structure emerged through the trees, a large Victorian-style house, its windows glowing faintly through the storm. A rusted old gas pump stood at the side of the driveway, its hose curled like a sleeping serpent. Daniel pulled up and killed the engine, listening to the rain hammering against his car. There was no sign of other guests, no movement from inside, just the dim, flickering lights. He stepped out, pulling his coat tightly around himself, and made his way toward the front door. His footsteps splashed through puddles, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and old wood. A small brass bell jingled as he stepped inside. The lobby was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of dust and aged wallpaper. A large wooden desk sat against the far wall, a guest book resting open. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded. A woman stood behind the desk, her back turned to him. She was tall, her figure thin beneath an old-fashioned dress. Her dark hair was pulled into a bun, strands escaping at odd angles. Something about her posture unsettled him. A stiffness, like a marionette on too tight strings. She turned slowly, her face pale, lips colorless. "Welcome to Willow House," she said. Her voice was soft, yet hollow, as though spoken from a great distance. "Hi," Daniel said, forcing a smile. I need a room for the night. Also, do you still sell gas?" She nodded once. "We do. The price is high." Daniel shrugged. "I don't have much choice." She slid a key across the desk. "Room 12, upstairs. Down the hall." He hesitated. "Do you take credit cards?" She smiled and didn't reach her eyes. "Cash only." Something about the place made his skin crawl, but exhaustion won over his unease. He dug out a few bills, took the key, and thanked her before heading upstairs. The hallway was long and narrow, lined with doors, each one marked with a tarnished brass number. His room was at the very end. The key turned with a reluctant click and the door swung inward. The room was small, but clean. A single bed sat against the wall, covered in an old quilt. A wooden chair sat beside the window and an armoire loomed in the corner, its doors slightly ajar. He locked the door behind him. The rain had slowed to a whisper, tapping gently against the glass. He let out a breath, rubbing the stiffness from his neck. Something about the place felt wrong, as if the walls held a breath, waiting. Shrugging off the unease, he stripped down to his undershirt and collapsed onto the bed. The mattress was firm, the blankets cool against his skin. He reached over to turn off the lamp. Darkness swallowed the room. The house creaked softly, as if shifting in its sleep. Wind rattled the window pane, then a sound, soft, a whisper of fabric, like someone shifting on the chair. His eyes snapped open. The room was silent, but in the dim glow of the streetlight outside, the chair by the window was no longer empty. A figure sat there, a woman. Her form was draped in a nightgown, her hands folded in her lap. Her head was turned toward him, though her face was obscured by darkness. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His mind scrambled for logic. Had he left the door unlocked? Had someone come in? His fingers inched toward the lamp. Click, light flooded the room. The chair was empty. The blankets beneath him felt ice cold, his skin prickling with sweat. Slowly, he sat up, scanning the room. The armoire's doors were slightly wider now. Just a sliver. Had they been like that before? He swallowed, forcing a chuckle. Too tired for this, he muttered. Lying back down, he turned the lamp off once more. This time he kept his eyes closed. Sleep came in uneasy waves. The house creaked, the wind whispered, then closer, a breath, just beside the bed. Daniel froze. A presence loomed over him, heavy and suffocating. The air smelled of damp earth and something rotten, like flowers left to die in stagnant water. A hand touched his shoulder, cold, clammy. His eyes flew open. The woman stood over him. Her face was pale, her skin bruised and mottled. Her eyes, empty black pits, stared down at him. Her lips parted, revealing a mouth too wide, teeth too sharp. Leave, she whispered. Daniel scrambled back, his heart pounding. The room was freezing. His breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the dim light. The woman remained still, watching. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. The chair sat empty once more. The air was warm again. Daniel bolted upright, grabbing his things, fumbling with the door. He tore through the hallway, down the stairs. The woman at the desk was gone. The guest book was gone. The front door, now slightly ajar, swung open as he rushed out. The gas pump outside stood silent, covered in rust, vines creeping over it. His car sat where he left it, but dust coated the windshield, as if it had been there for years. Daniel didn't question it. He jumped inside, turned the key. The engine roared to life. He didn't look back as he sped away, the road stretching endlessly before him. The rain had stopped. The moon hung low in the sky, pale and watching, and in the rearview mirror, for just a second, a woman sat in the back seat, smiling. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The first time Elise saw the woman in the window, she thought it was a trick of the light. A shadowy figure, barely outlined against the moonlit glass of the abandoned house across the street. She had just moved into the neighborhood, a quiet street lined with aging Victorian homes, some restored, some left to decay. The house in question was one of the latter, its peeling paint and broken shutters whispering of a time when it had been something more. She stared at the figure, her breath catching in her throat. It stood there motionless, just beyond the cracked glass, as though it was watching her. Elise blinked, and when she looked again, the figure was gone. Just tired, she told herself, rubbing her eyes and stepping away from her bedroom window. Moving was exhausting, and she'd spent the whole day unpacking boxes. It had to be her imagination. But the uneasy feeling in her stomach lingered as she got into bed, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood settling into the night. The following night, she saw it again. This time she was sure. The shape of a woman, slightly hunched, her hair hanging in limp strands over her face. She stood there unmoving, her hollow gaze directed toward Elise's house. Elise's heart pounded. Was it a squatter? Some drifter who had taken up residence in the abandoned home? Should she call the police? She reached for her phone, but something stopped her. The figure didn't move, didn't sway, didn't breathe. There was something unnatural about her stillness, something wrong. Elise watched for nearly 10 minutes before the woman seemed to dissolve into the darkness. That night, she didn't sleep. The next morning, Elise asked her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Jensen, about the house. "Oh, that old place?" the elderly woman said, shaking her head. "No one's lived there for years, dear. Not since the Carter family tragedy." Elise leaned forward. "Tragedy?" Mrs. Jensen's face darkened. "It's a sad story. The Carters lived there in the 50s. Nice mother, father, and their little girl, Emily. But one night, the mother, she just lost it. Took an axe to her husband, then drowned the girl in the bathtub. Afterwards, she..." Mrs. Jensen hesitated, lowering her voice. "She slit her own throat." Elise shivered. "That's awful." "Some say the house is cursed," Mrs. Jensen continued. "A few people tried to live there over the years, but they never stayed long. Strange noises, furniture moving on its own. One woman even claimed to see Emily, dripping wet, standing at the foot of her bed." She sighed, shaking her head. "Eventually, the city sealed it up. No one's been inside for at least a decade." Elise didn't want to believe in ghosts, but she also couldn't deny what she'd seen. That night, she kept her curtains closed. She told herself she wouldn't look, but some part of her couldn't resist. At 2:13 a.m., she peeked. The woman was there. Only this time, she wasn't in the window. She was outside, standing in Elise's yard. A strangled gasp caught in her throat. The woman stood motionless, her wet, stringy hair clinging to her face. Her dress was tattered, the fabric soaked and sticking to her gaunt frame. Her eyes, dark pits, were fixed on Elise's window. Elise stumbled backward, her heart slamming against her ribs. She fumbled for her phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. 911, what's your emergency?" There's a woman in my yard," she whispered, forcing herself to look again. The woman was gone. "Elise?" The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. I think someone's outside," she stammered, peering through the blinds, but there was nothing. The yard was empty. "Never mind. I must have been mistaken." She hung up, her hands trembling. Maybe she was losing it, maybe Mrs. Jensen's story had gotten into her head. But that night, she dreamt of water. Cold, murky water dragging her down, filling her lungs. And in the depths, she saw her. The woman. Pale hands reaching, lips moving in a silent scream. Elise woke up choking. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. The following days were worse. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She kept the curtains drawn, locked the doors, double-checked the windows, but every night, at exactly 2:13 a.m., the woman appeared. Sometimes in the yard, sometimes at her doorstep. Each night, she was closer. Then, one night, Elise woke to the sound of water. Drip, drip, drip. She sat up, her pulse hammering. The noise was coming from the bathroom. Drip, drip. The faucet. Elise forced herself out of bed. The house was silent, the air thick with something she couldn't name. She reached the bathroom door, hesitated, then pushed it open. The faucet was on. Water pooled in the sink, swirling lazily down the drain. She frowned, stepping forward to turn it off. Then she saw the footprints. Wet, bare footprints leading from the tub to where she stood. Her breath hitched. She turned, her body locking in place. The woman was behind her. Soaking wet, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. A cold, clammy hand reached out, brushing Elise's arm. Darkness swallowed her. She woke up in her bed, gasping for air, her sheets soaked, not with sweat, but with water. Something was wrong. She needed to get out of the house. Grabbing her phone and keys, she bolted for the door. But as she reached for the knob, the air grew heavy, the walls seeming to close in. A whisper brushed against her ear. "You let her in." Elise whirled around. The woman stood inches away, her mouth stretched into an inhuman grin. Elise screamed. Darkness. When she came to, she was on the floor. Her phone lay a few feet away, the screen cracked. The house was silent again, but something was different. The air felt wrong. She pushed herself up, disoriented, her head pounding. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling. It was 2:13 a.m. A shadow flickered at the edge of her vision. Slowly she turned. The woman was inside, and this time she wasn't leaving. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The rain had been falling in steady sheets all evening, turning the narrow country road into a slick, glistening ribbon. Jenna kept her hands tight on the steering wheel, squinting against the glare of her headlights bouncing off the wet pavement. She hadn't meant to stay so late at her friend's house, but the warmth of good company had distracted her from the passing hours. Now, well past midnight, she was alone on the road, the only signs of life being the occasional house with a dim porch light flickering in the storm. A sudden movement at the edge of her vision made her heart skip a beat. She barely had time to register the figure on the side of the road before she swerved, tires skidding slightly on the wet surface. Her breath came in quick, sharp gasps as she straightened the car. Someone had been standing there. A woman. Jenna slowed the car, peering into the rearview mirror. There was nothing but darkness, the rain hammering down and obscuring her view. She let out a shaky breath and pressed forward. Minutes passed in silence, except for the rhythmic thudding of raindrops on the roof. Then, movement again, this time directly ahead. Jenna slammed the brakes. A woman stood in the middle of the road, drenched, her long black hair hanging in heavy strands over her face. She wore a thin white dress, now soaked and clinging to her frail form. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply stood there, head slightly tilted, watching. Jenna hesitated, her fingers tightening around the wheel. The logical part of her brain told her this woman must be in trouble. Perhaps her car had broken down. Maybe she needed help. Jenna rolled down her window just an inch. "Are you okay?" she called out, her voice barely audible over the rain. The woman lifted her head slightly. Her skin was pale, almost unnaturally so. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Jenna felt an inexplicable chill snake down her spine. She checked the road behind her. Empty. No other cars, no houses nearby. When she looked back, the woman was gone. Jenna's breath hitched. Her foot hovered over the gas pedal. Maybe the rain had played tricks on her eyes. Maybe exhaustion was making her see things. She eased her foot down, the car creeping forward. Then, a whisper. Soft. Right beside her ear. "Don't go," Jenna shrieked, slamming on the brakes. Her head whipped around, but the passenger seat was empty. Her chest heaved as she fought for breath, her pulse hammering in her ears. She swallowed hard, staring straight ahead. The woman was back. But this time, she was closer, standing directly in front of the hood of the car. Jenna barely had time to react before the woman started moving toward her. Not walking, gliding. Her feet didn't touch the ground, her soaked dress trailing behind her unnaturally. Jenna's instincts screamed at her to move, to drive, to do anything, but she was frozen. The woman came closer, her lips parting, her eyes black voids. Then she was gone. Just like that. Jenna let out a shaky breath, her body trembling. She reached for her phone, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had to get out of there. The car lurched forward as she hit the gas. She kept her eyes on the road, refusing to check the mirrors, refusing to look anywhere but straight ahead. But the whisper returned, soft, cold, this time right behind her. "You shouldn't have come this way," Jenna screamed, jerking the wheel violently. The car skidded sideways, spinning on the wet road before she managed to regain control. Then she saw it. A bridge. Old, rickety, barely illuminated by the weak glow of her headlights. Her stomach twisted. She knew this bridge. The stories, the legends. She had heard them all. Decades ago, a woman had been found here. Drowned. Some said she had fallen, others said she had jumped. But the most chilling version of the tale suggested she had been pushed. And now Jenna was here. She felt the weight of something pressing down on her shoulders, the air inside the car growing impossibly cold. The road narrowed as she neared the bridge. Her fingers trembled on the wheel. Then she heard it, a sob. Not her own, a woman's, from the back seat. Jenna didn't want to look. She didn't want to see, but her body betrayed her. Slowly, as if pulled by an unseen force, she turned her head. The woman sat there, soggy hair draped over her face, water dripping onto the seat. Her head tilted, dark eyes locked onto Jenna's. Jenna gasped, her vision blurring. She swerved, the car veering dangerously close to the edge of the bridge. Then the woman spoke. "You have to see." Jenna's body lurched forward as something invisible yanked her. The world tilted. No, the car tilted. She was falling. The last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her was the pale, expressionless face of the woman. And then silence. The next morning, the bridge was empty, except for a single soaked white dress lying at the edge of the water. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The old house sat at the end of a forgotten road, nestled between twisted trees and choked by ivy that climbed its stone walls like fingers grasping for something unseen. No one lived there anymore, but for as long as anyone could remember, it had been whispered about in town. The Mitchell House, a place cursed by something no one dared to name. Emily had heard the stories all her life. They were the kind of tales old folks told in hushed voices over coffee, glancing toward the dark hills where the house lay waiting. It was haunted, they said. People who went inside never came back the same, if they came back at all. She didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. But when her friends dared her to spend the night inside, she didn't back down. Just one night, Jake had said, grinning as he pressed a flashlight into her hand. You get through it, and we'll buy you dinner for a week. So she went. The house loomed in the moonlight, its gabled roof like the jagged teeth of an open mouth. The front door was swollen with age, its paint peeling in long, curling strips. The moment she stepped inside, the air changed. It was colder, stale, the kind of chill that settled into bones rather than skin. Her footsteps echoed on the warped wooden floor as she made her way through the entry hall. The furniture was still there, covered in sheets, ghost-like in the dim light. She could almost imagine people moving through the house, their voices lost in time. She chose a spot in what had once been the living room, unrolling her sleeping bag near the fireplace. The house was silent except for the occasional groan of wood shifting, but she had expected that. Old houses made noises. She clicked on her flashlight and began to explore. The kitchen was frozen in time. Plates still sat on the counters, now thick with dust. A chair lay overturned near the table, as if someone had left in a hurry. She turned toward the hallway, and something caught her eye. A shadow. It flickered at the edge of her vision, vanishing the moment she looked directly at it. Her breath caught, but she forced herself to move forward. It was just her nerves, just the dark playing tricks. The staircase was worse. It groaned beneath her weight, each step sending echoes up the walls. The second floor smelled of old paper and mildew. She found the bedrooms, 4 of them, each one abandoned, the beds still made as if expecting their owners to return. She lingered at the last room where the wallpaper had peeled in long strips, exposing the skeletal laths beneath. A picture frame sat on the bedside table. She picked it up. The glass was cracked, but the photo inside was still visible. A family, a man, a woman, and a little girl between them. The girl had wide, empty eyes as if the photographer had captured something not meant to be seen. A sudden creak made her whirl around. The door. It was swinging shut. She ran forward, catching it before it closed completely. Her pulse hammered. The air was thick now, charged like the weight of an unseen presence pressing down. She wasn't alone. She rushed back downstairs, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. She told herself she was imagining things, that she was letting the stories get to her. But then she heard it, a whisper. Low, crooning, right behind her. She spun, light slicing through the darkness. Nothing. Her breath came in short gasps. The flashlight flickered. The whispering continued. She couldn't make out words, only the cadence, a soft rhythmic murmur like someone speaking just beneath their breath. She turned off the flashlight. Darkness swallowed her. The whispering stopped. Silence, heavy, suffocating. Then a footstep. Not hers. It came from the hallway. Slow, deliberate. Another step. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to wake up, to be anywhere but here. A breath, warm and damp, brushed against her ear. She bolted for the door. Her hands fumbled for the knob, slick with sweat. It wouldn't turn, wouldn't move. Another breath. Closer. She turned, and in the pale light spilling through the windows, she saw it. A figure. Thin, hollow-eyed. A woman, her skin stretched tight over sharp bones. She stood just beyond the threshold of the kitchen, her head tilted, watching. Emily's breath hitched. The woman lifted a hand, long fingers curled like claws. Emily screamed. The door flew open behind her. She stumbled backward, the cold night air rushing in as she fell onto the porch. The woman didn't move. She only smiled, a slow, awful smile, as the door slammed shut. Emily ran. She didn't stop until she reached the road where Jake and the others were waiting. She couldn't speak. Couldn't explain. But as she looked back toward the house, the windows black as empty sockets, she knew she had been warned. She had been seen. And she had not been welcome. Story the end.